Hello, world history students, and welcome to this short screencast on the effects of the 1918 influenza pandemic on India. More people died of the flu in the great pandemic of 1918-1919 in India than in any other place in the world. In fact, just the number of deaths in India from influenza a little more than a year, from the spring of 1918 to the spring of 1919, were greater than the total number of people who died in World War One. And taking a closer look at that is an excellent way for us to see how influenza and its spread was connected to both World War One and imperialism. So our main topic so far in this class. The purpose of this screencast is to help students get ready to read an article, Vital Statistics, How the Spanish Flu of 1918 Changed India. And there's an excerpt from that I have for students to read. The article was written by a woman who's a science journalist, Laura Spinney, who also wrote a book on the influenza of 1918. And then this article is information from that book that she wrote for a magazine that's published in India. A lot of people in India read and write English because it was a British colony. So it's a magazine in India. And so this appeared there in 1918. There's several things about the article that make it interesting and relevant today. For one thing, the influenza behaves very similarly to the coronavirus that we are now living under, that is affecting all of our lives so much. And in the article, she talks about how viruses behave, and it has a lot of information, a lot of similarities to what we're dealing with a little more than 100 years later. It also shows how global it is. Even though this article was about India, the picture at the top of the article, which is here, is from St. Louis in the United States. And in fact, this picture is all over the place because in the United States right now, many people who talk about flattening the curve or keeping the peak of the worst effects of the disease from getting so high that hospitals can't deal. That whole phrase, flattening the curve, deals with comparisons between, or partially related to comparisons between St. Louis, where this picture was taken, and where these Red Cross nurses are waiting for victims of the flu so they can put them or help them go to the hospital, compared to Philadelphia. And St. Louis did much better than Philadelphia because they practiced social isolation the way we are now. So that all kind of ties together to what we are doing. Now, one thing you might notice is that I'm saying the influenza of 1918 instead of the other name that people use for it in the United States, sometimes the Spanish flu. And the reason for that is that's really misleading. And it's not a name that was used all over the world. And so, since this is a world history class, world historians refer to this as the influenza outbreak or influenza pandemic of 1918, or sometimes 1918, 1919. Let me show you what's happening here with this map. This will help you to understand the article. Now, this might just look like some gibberish at first, so if you want to pause and take a look at it more closely, what this is showing, use pointer, what this is showing is you can use the numbers to trace the spread of the pandemic. So 0 means right where it started. So those are the first outbreaks. And you'll notice, if you look closely, those are all in the United States. And the first outbreak of the disease in large numbers was near an army base in Kansas. So that's would be the equivalent to Wuhan, China, in our current novel coronavirus or COVID-19 situation. But when that happened, it wasn't widely publicized. It was an army base, and the United States was at war, and the information was controlled. So people at the base knew people were getting sick and dying, but it wasn't publicized around the country. Spain, which right here, you can see is number 2. So 2 months after the outbreak in Kansas, there's an outbreak in Spain. In the meantime, this is a troop ship. So people had the virus were coming from Kansas, sick on the ship, They get here, and then it starts to spread in Europe. But Spain wasn't in the war, so there wasn't any censorship or as much censorship. And so the first place that many people in the English speaking world read about people having the influenza was in Spain. So they called it the Spanish flu. But that's not the first place where a lot of people had it, which was actually, as I mentioned, in Kansas. So the name doesn't really help us. Spain wasn't where it started. It's not where the most people died. We don't even really know where it started when we say where the epidemic first broke out. The virus doesn't have a nationality. There's three different theories about where it might have come from. Somewhere else in Kansas, somewhere in northwestern France, somewhere in northern China. Those are three possibilities, but we really don't know. It would seem the Kansas or France ones are the best possibility there. So if you look at the numbers, though, the numbers tell you how long after it first started to spread did a place get it. So you can see it comes to India in two waves, 3 months after, and then 7 months after. And the first place it hits is right here. You can also see the other places where it spreads through British colonies, especially Freeport in Sierra Leone, Cape Town in South Africa, Mombasa, Kenya. Yeah. Now, India is connected into all this because India was part of the British Empire. And British India is right here and includes what are today 5 different countries, including India. All the red areas were part of the British Empire. And so things moved, people, goods, food, diseases moved between those places. We saw that in our poetry and propaganda last week. This is a slide that you might come back to when you're reading because I circled some of the place names that are in the reading to kind of help you to visualize them. So you don't need to write these down, but when you're reading it, you might look back at this slide so you can kind of see where they're referring. The first place is the city that was then known as Bombay and now is known as Mumbai. That was the first place where there was a huge outbreak in India. So that will come up. We'll also talk about some river valleys where a lot of people live. Here's the Ganges River Valley, which Indians often call just the Ganga. It's like the mother of rivers. There's a lot of holy places along it. This is also one of the most densely populated places on the planet. Hundreds of millions of people live here. And also the Punjab, which is here, the Indus River Valley. A lot of the soldiers who fought in World War I were from the Punjab area. So these are places that are in the article. The article will also talk about the Western Front, where huge masses of troops were, including many troops from India and from around the world. So American soldiers maybe brought the virus into the Western Front, or again, some other people believe it might have first been here in northwestern France, and then Americans brought it back to Kansas. But here on the Western Front, where millions and millions of men came together to fight, and also millions of women supporting the war, this densely packed area. And we've seen that. These are British soldiers who are from India. So even though they're from India, they're fighting on the Allied side. The picture up here is a pretty famous picture. You see this one a lot. And that's in Britain where people were getting organized. But then here they are in France near the Western Front. Different soldiers, but from the same Indian religious ethnic group, Sikhs, many of whom are from the Punjab, that area. So Indian troops then would have probably been the people who carried the virus that causes influenza from World War I, Western Front, back to India. So as you read through that, then at the end of the article, it mentions this man here, one of the most famous people in world history, Mohandas K. Gandhi. And Gandhi was just emerging at that time, he's pretty young there, as a leader in the Indian independence movement. So India had been a colony of Britain. As you know, it's an independent country today. And when this was happening, the article is going to use this phrase, satyagraha, which means like holding on to the truth. It's a religious sounding word, and it was the word that Gandhi used for his nonviolent civil disobedience, breaking the law to resist. And that led to an event that happened 101 years ago this week, April 13th, in a town called Amritsar, which is in the Punjab, where British soldiers wound up firing on, didn't wind up, they were ordered to fire onto a crowd of unarmed, nonviolent protesters, killing many of them. It's a memorial to it that you see in this picture. And that massacre is one of the things that inspired many Indian people to join with Gandhi and others who were calling for India to become independent. So this influenza in India doesn't just connect to the big two of the big ideas so far, and it's spread there by World War One into a British colony, imperialism. But it also connects to decolonization when people in India started to break away from the British, in part because the British government not only couldn't keep them safe during this pandemic, but killed people who were protesting against British treatment of them. So it's an article that connects a lot of important things. Won't go through this slide here. This is just vocabulary. These are not words to write down. The only word that I bolded there is satyagraha, because it'll come up again. But this is just a word bank, pretty much in order of the words that are in the excerpt. So as you're reading it, you might have this slide up or just freeze the video here in case you need to understand any of these words. To have you do an open-ended reflection on this reading, kind of looking at what does it say, what do you think about that, what can you figure out, and how can you make any connections to it. So I hope that you find this bit of history interesting in terms of helping us understand what we're all dealing with right now in the present. All right. Thanks for listening.